It usually happens in the dark, in that fragile space between sleep and wakefulness. You see something, just for a second, a shadow at the foot of your bed, a figure in the corner, a whisper in a room that should be silent. You blink, you shake your head, you tell yourself it was nothing. But part of you wonders, was it? Let's talk about apparitions of the mind. Hallucinations aren't always signs of madness. They aren't always products of drugs or illness. In fact, they're more common than we think. And they often happen to people who are on paper perfectly sane. Grief hallucinations, sleep paralysis visions, post-traumatic intrusions, stress-induced sightings, faces in crowds that don't exist, voices that call our names when no one is near. Are these malfunctions of the brain or messages from somewhere deeper? Let's talk about the ghost in the ICU. It's a known phenomenon. People in intensive care, especially after major trauma or coma, often report seeing figures. Sometimes it's loved ones. Sometimes it's something darker shadow people, watchers, beings who stand silently at the door. Doctors explain it as delirium, neural disorientation, the brain's desperate attempt to make sense of overstimulation and sedation. But the patients, they remember it vividly. Some describe full conversations. Others say they were warned or told something they couldn't have known. Let's talk about Charles Bonnet syndrome. It affects people with vision loss. They begin seeing things that aren't there, detailed, realistic, people, animals, patterns. And here's the twist. They know it's not real. They can explain it. They're aware of the illusion, but the images persist. It's not psychosis. It's the brain filling in the blank spaces, projecting reality where none exists. Sound familiar? Now ask yourself this. When you see a shadow move where nothing should be, is it a malfunction? Or is it the subconscious trying to say something? Let's talk about symbolic hallucinations. In trauma therapy, people often report intrusive visions, not always memories, sometimes symbols. A mother who lost her child sees burning flowers in dreams. A man with combat PTSD sees a wolf in mirrors. A woman recovering from assault feels invisible hands at night. Are these metaphors? Repressed feelings? Neural patterns replaying fear? Or are they the mind trying to speak its own language? Because what we call ghosts might just be ourselves, desperately trying to be heard. Sometimes, the ghost doesn't appear as a figure. It comes as a weight, a sensation, a knowing. The hallway feels colder than it should. The back of your neck tingles. You feel watched, even when you're alone. You flip the lights on, check the doors, tell yourself it's nothing. But your body remembers something your mind refuses to name. Let's talk about trauma and hallucination. Not all wounds bleed. Some hide deep, and when they aren't seen, they find other ways to show themselves. Flashbacks, body memories, sensory distortions, apparitions that aren't ghosts, but personified pain. Psychologists call it dissociation, a protective mechanism. When reality becomes too much, the mind splits off, creates distance, and in that gap, the haunting begins. Let's talk about shadow people. They're one of the most commonly reported hallucinations, often seen during sleep paralysis, but also during trauma recovery, intense stress, or after loss. They appear at the edge of vision. They don't move like humans. They don't speak. And yet, they're always watching. Neurologists will say it's the result of REM intrusion, a dream state overlapping waking consciousness. But survivors of abuse say something else. They've seen those shadows since childhood. They come when they remember. They come when they try to speak. Let's talk about the brain's need for metaphor. The mind doesn't always speak in words, especially not after trauma. It speaks in imagery, in symbols, in ghosts. A woman who was silenced by her abuser sees her room filled with choking fog. A man abandoned by his father feels a presence in his house that always leaves just before he can face it. Are these delusions? Or is the brain trying to externalize what cannot be spoken? Let's talk about ancestral trauma. Epigenetics shows that trauma doesn't just scar individuals. It leaves traces in DNA, passed down, carried in silence. And sometimes people have visions they can't explain, places they've never been, memories that aren't theirs, fear that belongs to another time. They feel haunted, not by spirits, but by the weight of their lineage. Let's talk about cultural hauntings. In many cultures, visions of the dead are not dismissed. They're respected, listened to, understood as messages from the unconscious, the ancestors, the divine. Western science calls them hallucinations. But what if that's just a label we use when we're afraid to listen? What if the ghost isn't asking to be exorcised, but to be understood? Let's pause. Not all hauntings come from outside. Some come from within, from memories buried so deep, they need a mask to show their face. And when they do, you can either fight them or listen. We're taught to fear hallucinations, to dismiss them, to medicate them, to silence them. But what if they're not the problem? What if they're the truth, spoken in a language we've forgotten how to hear? Let's talk about the ghosts that reveal instead of confuse. There are countless reports from patients in therapy, trauma survivors, near-death experiencers, of visions that aren't random. They're precise, personal, piercing. A man recovering from a head injury begins seeing a young girl in his home. She stands in the hallway, never speaks. In therapy, he begins exploring early childhood, finds out he had a twin sister, stillborn, never told to him. No proof, no memories, just a presence, and a name that came in a dream. Coincidence, fantasy, or memory filtered through the only medium left, the unconscious. Let's talk about the logic of the subconscious. Your conscious mind operates in facts, linear time, words, but your subconscious, it speaks in symbols, patterns, dreams, flashbacks, apparitions, not to deceive you, but to protect you, to process what your waking mind can't accept. And when those symbols appear as ghosts, they might be carrying something vital. Let's talk about the man who saw fire. He came in for anxiety. No trauma he could name. But every night, in dreams and waking flashes, he saw burning corridors, children screaming. His hands were always covered in soot. Under hypnosis, a memory surfaced, not from this life, he claimed, but from a fire decades ago. One he swore he started, as a child, in a life that wasn't his. You can debate reincarnation, or suppressed guilt, or imagination. But what matters isn't whether it was real, but what it unlocked. After confronting the visions, his panic attacks stopped. His tremors faded. He slept. Let's talk about what hallucinations actually are. They're not random noise. They're data, distorted by emotion, wrapped in metaphor, filtered through fear, but they are your data. And sometimes they know more than you do. Let's talk about PTSD visions. Combat veterans who see children that aren't there, survivors of abuse who hear footsteps at night, women who feel watched in empty rooms. Every time, the vision brings back the moment, the thing they haven't processed, the truth they've tried to bury. These ghosts don't want to scare. They want to be seen, because seeing is the first step to healing. Let's pause. What we call hallucination may sometimes be the only language the subconscious has left. Not a failure, not a disease, but a signal. And once you listen, you start to learn the most terrifying truth of all. The ghost is not the enemy. It's the part of you that remembers everything. Reality is supposed to be simple. What you see is what exists. What you hear is what was said. What you feel is yours alone. But what if that's a lie? What if your senses, your most trusted gatekeepers, are just filters shaped by memory, distorted by trauma, manipulated by biology? And if that's true, then how can you tell the difference between a ghost and your mind calling for help? Let's talk about the line between madness and insight. Throughout history, those who claimed to see what others could not were revered or destroyed. Mystics, oracles, prophets, visionaries. Some were burned, some were medicated, some became legends. But the question remains, when someone sees something no one else can, is that insanity? Or are they simply standing closer to the veil than the rest of us? Let's talk about shared hallucinations. There are documented cases, yes, real ones of multiple people seeing the same apparition. In hospitals, in war zones, after accidents, in families experiencing deep grief. Psychologists call this folie à douce delusion shared by more than one person. But others ask, if the hallucination can cross minds, doesn't that make it something more? Let's talk about meaning making. Even if the ghost isn't real in the material sense, what if the message it carries is? You see your dead mother standing at the foot of your bed. She tells you something you've refused to face, that you need to leave, that you're becoming like him, that your silence is killing you. And in the morning, you act. You leave the abuser. You start therapy. You cry for the first time in years. Was it a hallucination? A dream? A memory? Does it matter? Because it saved you. Let's talk about how ghosts change lives. There are people who credit visions with their healing, with finding purpose, with escaping suicide, with ending addiction. Not because the ghost was provable, but because it mattered. And this brings us to the most uncomfortable question of all. If a hallucination brings truth, is it still false? Let's pause. We live in an age obsessed with certainty, with evidence, with what can be measured, scanned, verified. But the human mind was not built on certainty. It was built on meaning, and meaning often comes through stories, symbols, visions. Yes, sometimes even ghosts. Let's close with this. You may never see an apparition, or you may see many. They might terrify you, or comfort you, or say nothing at all. But next time it happens, don't just ask if it's real. Ask what it wants you to know. Because sometimes what we call a ghost is just the truth in a costume strange enough to finally get our attention.